Ever get that feeling like when you're reading the news or scrolling online that someone's trying to, nudge your opinion in a certain direction?
Oh, absolutely. Like those subtle word choices, the ones that make you go, wait a minute, are they saying what I think they're saying?
Exactly. It's like they're trying to frame a story a certain way without you even realizing it. And that's what makes today's deep dive so fascinating.
Because it's all about going behind the headlines,
Yeah.
right? Using the power of language itself to unpack how we talk about really complex, sensitive issues.
And we're tackling a big one today, how Australian newspapers portrayed Islam, Arabs, and Muslims. They actually used the abbreviation IAM in this study before and after 9/11.
It's a heavy topic, no doubt.
Mhm.
And what makes this deep dive even more interesting is the way they went about it. They didn't just analyze a handful of articles. We're talking a massive amount of data.
Right. It wasn't just like, let's see what these two newspapers said about this one event. This was way more in depth.
Oh yeah, way more. They use this approach called corpus linguistics, which basically means they analyzed a mountain of newspaper articles, millions and millions of words.
So instead of a few drops of water, they looked at the entire ocean.
Exactly. And by doing that, they could start to spot those bigger patterns and trends that you might totally miss if you were just, casually reading a few articles here and there.
Right, like those subtle shifts in language that can be so incredibly revealing, even if you don't realize it at first.
Exactly. And that's what's so powerful about this kind of analysis.
Yeah.
It can expose those underlying biases, those hidden agendas that could be lurking beneath the surface.
And in this case, they zeroed in on two major Australian newspapers, The Age and The Australian. The goal, to figure out if and how their language might have shifted in the wake of 9/11.
Because here's the thing, those tiny shifts in wording, even the ones we barely register, can speak volumes. They can give you a glimpse into how a particular story is being framed for the reader, how they're being primed to think about certain groups or events.
It's like they're setting the stage without you even realizing it. So the million-dollar question is, did these newspapers actually change their tune after 9/11?
And if they did, what does that tell us about how the media can shape what people believe, especially during a really sensitive time like that?
Because it's not just about reporting the facts. It's about how those facts are presented, the language used to present them, and the impact that can have on people's perceptions.
Exactly. And trust me, what they found is seriously eye-opening. We're about to see just how impactful those word choices can be, even the ones that seem totally neutral at first glance.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. The research found a huge jump in how often these two newspapers, The Age and The Australian, mentioned the words Islam and Muslim right after 9/11. We're not talking about a small increase, but a massive surge.
Right, it was significant.
So before we even dive into the specific language they were using, just that increase alone, what does that tell us? What can we glean just from that change?
Well, even without looking at the context, just seeing Islam and Muslim constantly in the headlines, it creates a link. Even subconsciously, people start associating those terms with the events of 9/11.
So it's like, even if the words around them seemed neutral, just the repetition itself creates a kind of, I don't know, an unspoken connection.
Exactly. It's subtle but powerful. Just think about how often you hear a word or a phrase,
Yeah.
and suddenly you start noticing it everywhere.
Oh, totally. It's like that Bader-Meinhof phenomenon.
Yes, exactly. It's about creating an atmosphere, a feeling, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Right, like setting the stage without the audience even realizing it.
Okay,
So we got this spike in frequency, but this is where it gets even more interesting. It's not just about how often these words were used, but the words that tend to appear alongside them, right?
absolutely. That's where this idea of collocation comes in. It's a fancy way of saying words that like to hang out together. And by analyzing those word pairings, you can get a glimpse into how meaning is being constructed.
Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of word pairings did they find, and was there a difference between The Age and The Australian?
So pre-9/11, the Age actually used more neutral, sometimes even surprisingly positive language.
Really? Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they often use the word moderate in relation to Islam, like moderate Muslims or moderate Islam, emphasizing that middle ground.
Interesting. And how did that compare to The Australian?
Well, that's where we see a stark contrast. The Australian, even before 9/11, leaned more towards like hardline, radical, painting a very different picture. They even use phrases like Islamic Taliban.
Wow, okay. So we're already seeing two very different portrayals, even before 9/11. And then what happened after? Did things change?
Oh, they definitely did. After 9/11, the age's language shifted. Suddenly, they were using a lot of the same terms as the Australian, words that evoked this sense of extremism.
So it's like they both jumped on the, I don't know, the strong language bandwagon.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Both newspapers started specifically referring to people in Indonesia as Indonesian Muslims.
Wait, so before 9/11, Indonesians were just Indonesians.
Right. But afterward, there was this new layer added.
It's like they were saying, hey, look, even within this diverse nation, these people are different. That sends chills down my spine.
And that, my friend, speaks volumes. It's not just about individual words anymore. It's about subtly shaping how readers perceive an entire nation. And that's where things get, well, a little unsettling.
You know, it makes you wonder about the cumulative effect of these kinds of word choices. It's like by constantly emphasizing their Muslim identity, were they subtly suggesting that Indonesian Muslims were somehow different from other Indonesians?
Exactly. It really highlights how language can be used to shape narratives, to influence how we see the world around us, even in subtle ways. And it brings us to this fascinating concept called lexical priming.
Okay, break that down for me. Lexical priming, what is that?
So imagine your brain is like this giant network of interconnected ideas, right? Lexical priming suggests that when we're repeatedly exposed to certain word combinations, those connections get stronger, almost like they're being hardwired in our brains.
Interesting.
So even if we don't consciously realize it, those deeply ingrained connections can start to influence how we think about things.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. It's like, are we saying our brains are making these unconscious connections based on the language that we're exposed to?
Yes, exactly. And we might not even realize it's happening. It's like this hidden level of influence.
Wow. So even if I think I'm like reading the news objectively, the language itself could be shaping my opinions without me even realizing it.
Precisely. It's subtle, but that's what makes it so powerful. And it makes you realize how important it is to be mindful of the language we use and encounter every day.
Absolutely. So going back to this research, they didn't just identify these word pairings, they also categorized them into broader themes, right?
Yes, they did. So they kind of zoomed out to see the bigger picture. And what they found is that certain themes kept popping up.
Okay, like what? What kind of themes are we talking about?
Well, one common theme was this idea of a set of members, words that lumped Islam, Arabs, and Muslims together as a distinct group. They also found a lot of words related to warfare, terms like jihad or militant, really evoking this sense of conflict. But one of the most prevalent themes, and this is particularly relevant after 9/11, was the theme of excessive levels.
Okay, so that's where those words like extremist or radical come into play.
Exactly. And I think this is a really important point to consider, especially given how both newspapers, The Age and The Australian, significantly increased their use of those kinds of terms after 9/11.
Right, like it was a conscious decision to use stronger language.
And by framing Islam, Arabs, and Muslims in this light, consistently using terms that suggest they operate outside the bounds of what's considered normal, it creates a very specific narrative.
It does. It's like all these subtle cues, the increased frequency, the word choices, the themes, they all add up. And suddenly you have this narrative where Islam is inherently linked to extremism.
Which is why it's so important to be aware of these subtle ways language can shape our perceptions.
Absolutely, because it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the underlying messages they convey. So to wrap things up, I think the big takeaway here is that word choices, they're not just cosmetic, they carry a lot of weight. And understanding those subtle nuances can have a ripple effect on how we see the world and ultimately how we treat each other.
Well said.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored the fascinating and sometimes unsettling relationship between language, media, and perception. Until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on.